The French called him the African Napoleon, not as a compliment, as a warning to themselves. Because for 16 years, across thousands of miles of West African terrain, one man built an empire, outwitted a European superpower, moved an entire nation when he had to, built his own weapons factory when they tried to starve him of arms, and refused, absolutely refused, to submit. His name was Samori Touré, and the reason you've never heard it is exactly the reason we need to say it out loud today. Before we go any further, think about this. France was one of the most powerful military forces on Earth in the 1880s. Modern artillery, repeating rifles, tens of thousands of trained colonial troops. This man held them off for 16 years, using weapons his own blacksmiths built by hand. What does that tell you about what African leadership was actually capable of, and about how badly that truth needed to be buried? He was born around 1830 in the village of Menyambaladugu, in what is now southeastern Guinea. His family were Dioula traders, the Malinke merchant class who moved freely across West Africa, connecting trade routes between the forests and the savannah. His father traded. His grandfather traded. Young Samori learned the same routes, the same negotiations, the same art of reading people and terrain that would later make him one of the most tactically intelligent military minds the African continent produced in the 19th century. But the boy who would become a warrior king did not begin in a palace. He began on a trade road, and he almost never left it. Then, when Samori was around 20 years old, something happened that would change the entire direction of his life, and by extension, the history of West Africa. His mother was kidnapped. During one of the slave raids that terrorized communities across the region, Samori's mother was captured by King Sere Burle of the powerful Cisse clan. Samori had no army. He had no political power. He had nothing, except a merchant's understanding of negotiation and a son's love that refused to calculate what it would cost. So he did what most men would never do. He walked into the enemy's territory and offered himself. He told Sere Burle, "Take me instead. Let her go. I will serve you." According to tradition, he remained in service to the clan for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Not as a warrior, but as a man working off a debt of love. His mother was eventually released, and when Samori finally left, he had acquired something his captors had never intended to give him. He had learned how to handle firearms, how armies moved, how power was organized, and how discipline turned ordinary men into formidable forces. He walked out of captivity as a student of war who hadn't been to school. By 1855, Samori had returned to his people and begun gathering volunteers from the Camara clan. He gave them military training. He gave them Islamic education. He had deepened his faith during his years in captivity, eventually becoming a devoted Muslim of the Maliki school of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence. He combined spiritual authority with military command, understanding what African leaders across the continent already knew, that a people united in faith and purpose could accomplish what fractured groups never could. By 1861, he was named Keletigui, war commander, taking an oath to protect his people. By 1876, he was importing breech-loading rifles through the British colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone, paying for them with gold from the Bure mining district he had conquered specifically to fund his military. By 1878, he was strong enough to declare himself Fama, monarch of the Wassoulou Empire, with his capital at Bissandougou in present-day Guinea. Let that timeline land, from a merchant's son with nothing to the monarch of an empire, in roughly 20 years, without inheritance, without foreign backing, without the kind of institutional support that European empires took for granted. He built it from the ground up, through military conquest, diplomatic skill, and an administrative system so sophisticated that Encyclopedia Britannica's documented historical record compares it directly to Napoleon's. By the early 1880s, the Wassoulou Empire stretched across what is today Guinea, Mali, Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, and parts of Burkina Faso. An empire larger than many European nations. Samori had organized it into 162 former chiefdoms across 10 administrative provinces. He maintained intelligence networks stretching from what is today Mauritania to Nigeria. He ran a merit-based military promotion system. Soldiers advanced based on ability, not birth. He established an army he called the SOFA. By 1887, according to Wikipedia's documentation drawn from contemporary French military records, he could field 30,000 to 35,000 infantry and approximately 3,000 cavalry, organized in regular squadrons of 50. There was also a reserve force, 1 in every 10 men from every village, meaning each of his 10 provinces could furnish an additional 10,000 men if needed. This was not a tribal militia. This was a standing professional army, and it was about to meet France. The confrontation was inevitable. After the 1884 Berlin Conference, where European powers sat in a room in Germany and divided the African continent among themselves without inviting a single African, France began its aggressive push to link its territories from Senegal across to the Niger River and beyond. The Wassoulou Empire sat directly in their path. The first armed conflict came in February 1882. French forces under Commander Gustave Bourgnes Desbordes marched against one of Samori's allied towns. Samori's Sofa infantry met them in traditional frontal formations. The French opened fire with modern artillery and repeating rifles. The losses on Samori's side were immediate and severe. Any other leader might have kept fighting the same way and lost. Samori looked at what happened and changed everything overnight. He pivoted to guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run cavalry attacks, ambushes on French supply lines, flanking maneuvers that worked around French positions rather than meeting them head-on. He studied his enemies' patterns, identified their vulnerabilities, and built tactics specifically designed to neutralize their technological advantages. The Cambridge History of Africa's documented account of this period describes his military adaptability as extraordinary for any commander of the era, African or European. And he did something else, something that French military commanders found deeply unsettling. He set up an arms factory. Not a trading arrangement, not a supply route, a factory. According to Encyclopedia Britannica's record and Wikipedia's documentation from French military archives, Samori employed between 300 and 400 skilled blacksmiths who could repair and eventually replicate French chassepot rifles from scratch. His elite troops were equipped with the grass rifle, a modern French military weapon, maintained and rebuilt by craftsmen who had never attended a European engineering school. He was manufacturing his own weapons in West Africa in the 1880s, while simultaneously fighting off the most advanced colonial military on the continent. The French had expected a brief campaign. Instead, they fought a series of inconclusive battles stretching across years. In 1885, when French Colonel Combes attempted to seize the Bure goldfields, Samori's financial engine, Samori counterattacked with devastating precision. He divided his army into 3 mobile columns, moved around the French lines of communication, and forced a complete French withdrawal. France was not accustomed to being forced to withdraw. Samori understood, however, that he could not win the arms race indefinitely. So he did something strategically brilliant. He played the Europeans against each other. In January 1885, he sent an embassy to Freetown in British-controlled Sierra Leone, offering to place his kingdom under British protection. The British declined the formal arrangement. They did not want to antagonize France, but they allowed Samori to continue purchasing modern repeating rifles from their territory. He acquired weapons from the British while fighting the French. He used the colonial power's own rivalry as a supply chain. Between 1886 and 1887, he signed treaties with France, including the Treaty of Kaniba-Koura, that temporarily demarcated borders and halted open hostilities. He agreed, on paper, not to cross the Niger River. In exchange, the French agreed to recognize his sovereignty over his core territories. Both sides understood the treaties were temporary. Both sides were buying time. Samori used his to reorganize his forces, import more weapons, and consolidate his administration. The French used theirs to bring in reinforcements. In March 1891, French Colonel Louis Archinard marched from Nyamena, expecting to subdue Samori in a few weeks, with what he described as a lightning campaign. Archinard was a decorated officer, commanding a well-supplied force. He had studied Samori's previous battles. He believed the Wassoulou Empire was ready to collapse. He was wrong. Knowing his fortifications could not stop French artillery, Samori did not fight for the cities. He abandoned them. As the French marched into Kankan and then Bisandugu, they found, according to Wikipedia's documentation of French military records, cities already emptied, supplies removed, infrastructure denied. There was nothing worth taking. Meanwhile, Samori's forces surrounded French columns, cut supply lines, launched ambushes, and inflicted casualties that undermined Archinard's timeline completely. For every town the French took, they found themselves garrisoned in hostile territory with no clear enemy to engage directly. This was 1891. Samori had been fighting France since 1882, and he was not finished. Then he did something that had no precedent in the history of colonial resistance, something that historians have struggled to find an equivalent for anywhere in the world during this era. He moved his empire, the entire Wassoulou Empire, the army, the administration, the civilian population. He relocated the whole nation hundreds of kilometers eastward, into what is now northern Ivory Coast, away from the French advance. It took roughly 2 years, from 1891 to 1893. He did not simply retreat. He conquered new territory as he moved, pacifying local kingdoms, establishing a new capital in the city of Kong, in the northern Ivory Coast, and building what historians now call the Second Empire. He arrived in new territory with a functional state apparatus, governance, taxation, military command, Islamic education, and immediately began expanding. And he continued fighting France the entire time. As he moved, his forces practiced scorched earth systematically. Every town he abandoned was emptied of supplies and resources. Every road was denied. Wells were sealed. Crops were destroyed. The French, pursuing him across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain, found themselves chasing a moving nation that left them nothing. This was not desperation. This was strategy. As documented in Kirat Africa's scholarly account of his tactics, Samori had studied European military doctrine well enough to understand that supply lines were an army's critical vulnerability, and he turned the entire landscape into a weapon against French logistics. By 1893, while simultaneously managing a second empire in new territory, Samori remained undefeated. France had committed years of resources, multiple military campaigns, and the lives of thousands of soldiers and colonial troops. They had not caught him. Here is where the story becomes genuinely tragic. And here is where we have to be honest about complexity. Because Samori Touré was not a saint. He was a man of his era, shaped by the brutal logic of survival that his era demanded. The scorched earth tactics that denied the French their supply lines also devastated the civilian populations living in territories he moved through. Communities in southern Mali that stood in the path of his moving empire, or that allied with the French against him, sometimes for reasons of their own historical conflicts with the Wassoulou, suffered brutal reprisals. Wikipedia's documented account is direct. In some of those communities today, Samori Touré is not remembered as a hero. He is remembered as a ruler whose methods of control, enforced Islamic conversion campaigns in certain periods, and wartime devastation caused suffering that outlasted the French threat he was resisting. The Cambridge History of Africa documents local Africans who actively assisted the French during military campaigns, specifically because of harsh treatment under Samori's rule. This is the full truth that heroic narratives tend to erase. Great resistance does not require moral simplicity. Samori Touré resisted French colonialism with extraordinary genius and courage. He also caused real suffering to real people in the name of that resistance. Both things are true, and history does a disservice to everyone, to the people who suffered under him and to the people who were inspired by him, when it chooses only one side of that ledger. What is beyond dispute is the scale of what he built, the duration of what he sustained, and the quality of what he refused to surrender. By 1897, the net was closing. The French had learned from years of failure. They blocked his supply routes from Sierra Leone and Liberia. They coordinated multiple columns across different directions simultaneously, denying him the ability to maneuver freely. Famine began to hollow out his forces as the scorched earth that had protected him now trapped him. Desertion increased. His intelligence networks, which had kept him informed across thousands of miles, began to fail as the French tightened their grip. On May 1, 1898, French forces seized the great walled city of Sikasso, just north of his new empire, a city of 40,000 inhabitants, one of the most significant defensive structures in West Africa. Samori positioned his fighters in the Liberian forests for one final stand. But without supply lines, without ammunition, without the ability to feed an army in the field, the last resistance became a war of attrition he could not win. On September 29, 1898, a French force under Captain Henri Gouraud surprised Samori Touré's camp at Guélémou in present-day Ivory Coast. He was captured alive. He had been fighting France for 16 years. The French had a decision to make: execute him, which risked martyrdom, or exile him far enough away that his influence could not reach. They chose exile. He was taken to the island of Njole on the Ogooué River in Gabon, French Equatorial Africa, thousands of miles from Guinea, from the Ivory Coast, from everything he had built and everyone who knew his name. He contracted pneumonia. He died on June 2, 1900, at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon. He was around 70 years old. He had spent nearly half his life in active resistance to French colonialism. He had built 2 empires. He had organized an arms factory in the bush. He had moved a nation. He had held the most sophisticated colonial military force in West Africa at bay longer than any other leader of the era. He died in exile in Gabon, thousands of miles from home. And then, something happened that the French had not anticipated. Samori Touré refused to stay dead, not literally, but in the way that matters most to power, in memory. During the colonial period, French administrators worked to frame his memory as the story of a defeated tyrant, a man who had terrorized his own people, whose defeat was liberation rather than loss. For a time, it worked. The official narrative held. But according to Wikipedia's documented history of his legacy, during the interwar period, African intellectuals began to push back. They reclaimed the narrative. By the independence movements of the 1950s, Samori Touré had become a hero and rallying cry for anti-colonial parties across Guinea and Mali. His name was invoked not as history but as permission, proof that African sovereignty was worth fighting for and had already been fought for. And then his blood made the argument in the most direct possible way. Ahmed Sékou Touré, Samori's great-grandson, grew up carrying that lineage not as mythology but as identity. According to Britannica and multiple independent historical accounts, when French President Charles de Gaulle came to West Africa in 1958, offering French colonies a referendum, joined the new French community, a repackaged form of continued dependence. or take complete, immediate independence and lose all French aid, all technical support, all investment overnight. Every single French African territory voted yes to continued association with France. Everyone, except Guinea. Sékou Touré stood before de Gaulle in Conakry and delivered a speech that has entered the permanent record of African political history. He told de Gaulle directly, as documented by Assas Radio and multiple African historical archives, "We prefer poverty and freedom to riches in slavery." On September 28, 1958, Guinea voted 95% in favor of complete independence. On October 2, 1958, the Republic of Guinea was proclaimed, with Sékou Touré as its first president. Guinea became the first French-speaking state in Africa to achieve full independence. France's response was immediate and deliberately punitive. According to the Washington Post's contemporaneous reporting, cited in multiple historical accounts, departing French officials and civil servants destroyed Guinean infrastructure as they left. They unscrewed light bulbs, removed sewage pipeline plans, burned medicines, rather than leave them for the Guineans. The message was explicit. This is what defiance costs. Guinea paid it anyway. The bloodline that began with a merchant's son who sold himself into slavery to free his mother had produced, 3 generations later, the man who told the most powerful colonial nation in Francophone Africa, "We don't need you. We never did." Samori Touré's body lies in the Kamayan Mausoleum within the gardens of Conakry's Grand Mosque, in Guinea, the country that his great-grandson freed. The empire he built is gone. The weapons factory his blacksmiths ran is gone. The Second Empire in the Ivory Coast is gone. But the thing that could not be exiled to Gabon, the thing that French artillery could not destroy, the thing that 16 years of colonial campaign could not capture, that lives. His tomb is called Kamayan. In Malinke, it means a place of memory. They put him 3,000 miles from home in Gabon to make sure nobody remembered. Instead, he became the reason a nation refused to forget. There is a Malinke proverb that feels made for this story. The axe forgets, the tree remembers. France brought the axe. Samori Touré became the tree. And 60 years after they exiled him to Gabon, his great-grandson looked Charles de Gaulle in the eye and proved that the tree was still standing. Here is the question I want you to sit with, and I mean genuinely sit with it, not just scroll past it. Why is it that European military commanders from the same era, men who lost to Samori Touré in the field, men who spent 16 years unable to defeat him, are names you learned in school? Why are there statues in city squares? Why are there portraits in museum galleries? And why is the man who beat them, for 16 years, on his own land, with weapons his own people built by hand, why is he the one whose name got erased? What does it tell us about who controls the historical record, and what gets to be called a victory? Leave your answer in the comments, not a reaction, an answer, because this conversation deserves more than a thumbs up. If this is the first time you've heard the name Samori Touré, share this. That's how the record gets corrected, not by waiting for a textbook to do it. By us, right now, refusing to let the name stay buried. Follow this page, because we are just getting started, and the names history buried go far deeper than this one. This educational documentary examines verified historical sources. This video uses AI-assisted visuals and narration. All scripts, research, and creative direction are original human work. All claims in this story are verified and sourced. Check the pinned comment for our full FAQ and detailed references.